Thanks for recording that, Mark. I'd like to call this meeting to order. It is the Renaissance Academy special board meeting, emergency meeting of the Board of Directors for Renaissance Academy. The date is January 24th, 2022. For those who may not know, my name is Ryan Hunter, and I am the board chair. And we do have, we'll do a roll call, and then we'll introduce all of our staff, or add the staff also, just for the record. But start with Cameron Hughes.
Yes, Cameron Hughes, present.
Lance Anderson.
Present.
Emily Halleck. And I think you're muted.
Sorry, present.
Perfect. So Emily's here. Jen Lambert.
Here.
Perfect. I believe that makes up our board of directors. We appreciate all of you making time we got people headed to the airport, people coming from doctor's appointments. This is an emergency meeting. We appreciate everybody making the time, as well as the many staff and others who have joined us as well, different stakeholders. So in addition to them, we also have Mark. You probably know better than me, but we have our executive director, Mark. I saw Lachelle was on. I saw Stephanie Avery was on. I saw Patty Davis was on. If there are others that need to be recognized, let me know, or maybe just make mention so they're a part of the record.
That probably covers everybody. I mean, there are teachers probably logging on because I sent out a link to them as well.
Okay.
As the administration and staff, I think you covered it.
All right, perfect. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. This obviously is unique, and the times and the COVID cases are warranting this, but I'm going to turn the time over. We'll basically be covering several topics related to COVID-19 cases, as well as kind of our plan and the response the school can implement that will allow us to do our best to keep everybody healthy and safe, including all stakeholders, those students, family, faculty as well. So Mark, I'll turn the time to you and you can take over for a minute.
Okay. All right. There's been some updates prior to this meeting that were sent to the board, and they were the result of a collaboration of the administrative staff as well as the faculty during a meeting on Friday. But due to the fact that there's so many people in attendance, families that are probably hearing about this for the first time, I'll do a quick review of kind of the background issues, just so that they know, at least in general, some of the things that you guys have already been made aware of. So as we know, throughout the state, there's been a surge in cases since January that has had a kind of a ripple effect throughout not only schools, but the state in general. And the state had originally outlined several things that would allow schools specifically to respond to a surge like this. The most significant one of those things was the test to stay requirement that set a threshold for schools of varying sizes. So ours is the smallest type of school, so our threshold would be 30. That once you cross that number in a 14-day period, then you would have to work with the county to have them come in and do testing for everyone at the school. Anyone who tested positive would have to quarantine. Anybody who was negative could continue to attend. And the purpose of test to stay was they really were trying to avoid school closures for any prolonged period of time where an entire school is closed down, and minimize the amount of online learning that had to happen. So it was a good attempt. The problem we ran into in practical application is that when the surge happened, many health departments either lacked the staffing or are unable to get the tests required to do the testing that needs to be done. So that put schools starting about 2 weeks ago, maybe as far back as 3 weeks ago, into a position of crossing those thresholds and not having a response, because the response was supposed to be something in coordination with the health department. In order to address that, the governor on the 13th of January came out with announcing the suspension of some of the requirements, the legal requirements that we would have been obligated for. And one of those is the test to stay program, because it wasn't functional. The other one was giving schools flexibility on their number of days on campus. Part of the legislation that was passed last year was that schools who offered in-person instruction this year would have to offer it at least 4 days a week. So that gave you 1 day. If you wanted to build a flexible day into your schedule for this school year, you had some latitude to do that. But if you were on campus and returning to traditional on-campus learning, that you would have to do that a minimum of 4 days a week. So that's the other thing that his announcement suspended, was for a period of time, he designated a 2-week window, schools would be exempt from those two requirements. And a number of schools at the time, districts, decided to utilize that flexibility. Alpine School District around here was probably the one most are familiar with, where they straddled a long weekend that was already built into the schedule with a holiday, added another 2 days onto that. And by spanning that weekend, their hope was that they could have a 5-day break, bring case numbers down. They still met the 4 days each week by doing that. And that's not the only way you could have addressed that, given the flexibility provided by the governor, but it is one way. We chose not to do that at the time because our numbers weren't to the point where we would have crossed that threshold. But as the system in general, what the state can support across the board, whether that's testing or whether that's support from the health departments, or all of that is under a great deal of stress. And so that started to have some real impact on how we managed the information gathering and notification and tracking of cases here at Renaissance. And so, for example, that number 30 student cases has some exceptions to it. So as you were counting those confirmed cases, according to the health department, that number only includes students and not faculty. That number only includes tests that were given by a healthcare provider and tested, through a laboratory. So any of the like immediate result kind of tests, home testing, those things would not be counted in the number. And while we as schools were asked to report when we knew of people who had tested positive, we were told not to report numbers that were at home or rapid result kind of tests. So that's a pretty significant caveat, I think. When we started asking parents to report through the website, we didn't make a distinction between what kind of test you took. We didn't even ask you what kind of test you took. We just asked for a date. And so as we've tracked the number of cases and done that retroactive 14-day analysis, our number is always higher than it would be if it was following the county's guidelines. So that's the first challenge that we faced in making sure that we were getting good information and being able to provide notifications appropriately. Then another 2 issues arose that further complicated that. One is that testing supplies started to be short everywhere. And so we had multiple reports of people saying, well, I feel like I have COVID. I have all the symptoms of COVID. I tried to get a doctor's appointment, and the doctor said, if you think you have COVID, quarantine, don't come in for an appointment. If you can hold down liquids and you can breathe and not having respiratory distress, then don't bother to get a test and don't come into the office. And should either of those things become a problem, go right to the emergency room. So those kinds of people, because they're not tested and not quote confirmed, those wouldn't be included in the numbers as far as the county health guidelines go. So you can start to see that these things can be significant factors in how relevant or how accurate that threshold number is, that aggregate threshold number is. Furthermore, people who could get tests, then this is kind of like the third wave of complication. The people could get tests were sometimes waiting 5 days and more to get results back. And so there's been a few communications, typically through emails that I respond to directly, and maybe once or twice on social media, where people have asked, well, why is it that I'm being notified that my student was exposed so late? Because the emails I would send out would say, your students in this class or in this grade level, they could have been exposed during this window of time by a student who tested positive on X day. Well, a number of things contribute to whether and how relevant that and timely that data is. One is when the parents report it, which typically wasn't necessarily the problem, but they would report it when they got the results back. And increasingly over the last 2 weeks, those results have been further and further delayed beyond the 5 days. Now, given the fact that over the last 2 years, they've shortened, quarantine from 14 days to 5 days, we had more than a handful of cases where we were notified of results, positive results, after the student had already quarantined and returned to school. Then we got the confirmation that they had a case by the test results. So then if we, in some of those cases, if we had sent out, a notification to parents in that class, the person who possibly infected them the week before was already sitting in class back from their quarantine. And so the numbers became really cumbersome to manage. So for all those reasons, I went and met with the county, a representative from the county health department last week. And I said, listen, I realize that all of these, the tracking and the notifications are supposed to help us minimize the spread of the infection. But a lot of these things are not useful right now because the data that's going in to our calculations and our notifications is either delayed, corrupted, or exempt from use in, following the guidelines that you provided. And they agreed that was accurate, that they were running into the same issues when it came to what qualifies in the numbers and when those numbers, and to what extent they would be timely and accurate. So my question to them was, I wanted to find out, so what do we do next? As a school, what latitude do we have to make a plan that works for us when, the framework in general statewide has been compromised? So what I was told at the time was that for a charter school, that the responsibility falls upon the board of directors to come up with a response plan. Specifically, I think that's an advantage for us in a number of ways. Primarily that it gives us a chance to look at our school and our issues in a very detailed way. I can understand if you're Alpine School District, you got all these schools and different kids, and every one of those schools is kind of a microcosm of this issue, right? And so to say, well, to have some broader guidelines that say these aggregate numbers are going to trigger responses, is somewhat a management decision to be able to stay on top of things. We have the luxury of having a small one location school where we can look at the numbers more regularly and kind of develop patterns that are specific to our school that we can follow. And so my main question for them was, what happens to that 30 number if the automatic response that was built into the system is not functional? And I said, what I would prefer to do and be able to recommend to my board is that we test and quarantine more often and more aggressively on a classroom or grade level basis, rather than have this aggregate threshold where everybody ends up pivoting to online learning. You know, for us, that can be problematic and kind of overkill when it comes to a response, because you could have grade levels where, you know, there are very, very few cases in a given 2-week period, and another grade level where there's significantly more, and 2 or 3 grade levels, you know, could make up the majority of whatever that limit is. And so I asked them two follow-up questions, which was, one, where did that number 30 come from and how was it established? Because I wanted to know, was there some methodology behind it that, you know, said that mathematically speaking, that was some tipping point for schools with less than X amount of students, or some kind of analysis like that. And I was told that it was more or less an arbitrary decision. Now, that's a CDC guideline, so that's not one that's specific to Utah County, for example. But that's what I wanted to know was, you know, is that guideline of 30, or that threshold of 30, you know, evidence-based in some way as it relates to the size of our school? And they said no. The other thing was, is there anything that prevents us from taking a different approach where we're not dealing so much in the aggregate, we're trying to deal more specifically? And so we could set, you know, classroom quarantine thresholds at a level that we feel like it provides some early intervention. And then there'd be ripple effects for this, right? Because if we quarantine a class, some of those kids, if they've really been exposed, are going to have siblings in other grades. And so that may spill over into certain families being asked to quarantine all of their students. But that would still be a much smaller percentage of students who are online in a given 5-day period than saying we hit this aggregate threshold and all 760 kids go online. When I met with the staff on Friday, I really wanted to know what they felt about that. You know, when we did online learning a year and a half ago, the entire structure and staffing was set up completely differently. So if you had a student who ended up going from one to the other, that was more that was possible in that model because we had dedicated teachers already prepared to do that grade level online, and we were doing them in parallel to the on-campus programs. This year, we're not structured for that. We don't have that flexibility to do that. So if our priority was to keep kids on campus, then the online should really just be designed as a facilitator for minimizing the spread of infection and maximizing momentum, you know, in learning, so that we don't have these stops and starts in creating more difficulties as we move along. So that's kind of what led us to this point right now. If you have just you know, if you're just getting up to speed on why this meeting is being called, it's to address those kinds of things. So as an administrative team, when we sat down and tried to come up with, well, so how would we manage this? What do we feel like is the best way to manage this? And what recommendations would we provide to the board? We started out by saying, well, ultimately, what would be the objective of this plan? And the objective is that we create a plan that successfully incorporates the following 3 priorities. One, and the number 1 priority would be faculty and staff health and wellness. As you can see in you know, some of the news stories and things about press releases from Alpine School District, the ability to be in school is one thing. The whole separate issue is, are there qualified people at school that can teach? And that, you know, is there adequate staff ratios? And that it's not unusual this year to be constantly struggling with that. aside from COVID, because Utah, I think the last number I looked at, the unemployment rate was 2.1%. Really tight labor market, very difficult to fill positions. Even before this surge, we struggled to fill open positions of paraprofessionals and people to work in the kitchen, for example. And this surge just kind of adds to that pre-existing issue with staffing, because now if we have an unusual number of teachers out of the classroom, those aid positions have to turn into substitute positions, and not a lot of people are out substituting to backfill that. And so it alone could cause us to get to a point, and Alpine School District said this after their last meeting, was that they're starting to consider general safety as a concern just because of the imbalance of teachers to students in the schools. And I think to some degree, every school is going to struggle with that. So we need to ensure that our teachers are comfortable with the approach that we take, that they're comfortable being at school, and that we wanted to know, and Friday we spent quite a bit of time on this, finding out how comfortable they are with an effort to maintain on-campus learning. Was that a concern for anybody? And also, we wanted to get their feedback on where they thought and to what degree they thought COVID had been impacting student learning to this point. We'd had several discussions as an administrative team early in the year where we felt we had some really significant concerns about the impact that it's starting to show a year and a half in. And so we wanted to get the teachers' feedback on that, because we're kind of looking at school-wide assessment data and things, wanted to know in their classrooms, what's been their experience. And we had significant support. I don't know of any exceptions. The teachers feel like the students need to be in school on campus. They're willing to be here and teach. They had some concerns about the impact of having to maintain a parallel classroom and some of the additional responsibilities. And I'll talk about that as later in the plan, because I do think that we need to do some offsets there. But it's highly encouraging that the teachers are willing to continue to be on campus and provide that in-person instruction, and that they feel like that it is important that we continue that way and find ways to make sure that happens. So that being the case, we should also be very aware of the impact that it is having on them and the sacrifice that they're making in the other parts of our plan that we put together. So the second thing is that we focus on uninterrupted on-campus learning for as many students as possible, and that we don't implement any strategies that unnecessarily complicate our lives, that have some negative impact on what we're doing by adding additional burden to teachers when they're already starting to burn out. And we need to be very careful about that overall balance of the stress and the obligations that they're dealing with right now. And that may mean that we have to streamline some other things in the school with regard to activities, extracurriculars, those kinds of things, to ensure, or even prioritization of the subjects taught, to ensure that there is a healthy, maybe that's not the right word in this context, to make sure that there's a reasonable balance, for the amount of work that they have on their plate. So those were the three priorities that we wanted to incorporate into our plan. So our approach then, and the actual outline of the plan has 6 points. The first one is, I think that it's important that we try to establish testing capacity here on site to provide testing that we that we would prioritize for faculty and students and families that really need to make some decisions about quarantine. If they've been exposed, for example, but they haven't developed symptoms, it'd be really helpful to them and all their students if we could provide a test here and rule that in or out. Whereas they may wait for quite some time to tell us, and then if they end up sick, they've probably been here contagious until they find out. If they could go to the local clinic or the hospital and wait in a line that was less than a few hours long, then they could probably have done that, independently prior to now. But because that's not the case, we can provide that here. The state, back at the beginning of the school, over the summer, they developed a whole very detailed plan for how schools can implement a testing on site. It's got training for whoever's going to run it. It's got methodology for how to process the samples. There's certain approvals that you have to get in order to be able to handle those samples from a health point of view. So it walks you step by step through that. So they did a very good job of providing a comprehensive plan for schools that wanted to do that. Very early in the school year, we approached the subject or the possibility of doing this. The climate and the circumstances of the number of cases and things were very different then. And we decided not to move ahead. But I put that back on the table here for discussion because that would be very helpful to us. Now, that's contingent on a few things. One, we'd have to find somebody who is qualified to do the training and begin doing this testing almost immediately. And we would need to be able to get our hands on some actual test kits, which I do have an order in. The state has provided us with tests every month so far this school year. We have to order them, at 1 month at a time, but they have provided those up until now. So what they've told us is that they can continue to provide those but it's going to be a different kind of test than they have provided in the past. And I put an order for 750 of those in this morning, and they should be available for pickup on the 1st of February. Excuse me. So, until we get those in hand, we could still run into challenges there, but it does seem like we have some options for securing the testing. And I think that would help make sure that the data that we're using to make decisions about quarantine and stuff is timely, when right now that can't be guaranteed if we're not in control of it. So that's point number one. Point number two would be that each general education classroom would provide quarantine support for students or the whole class if the class is quarantined through the Google Classroom. The experience of that Google Classroom is going to be different because the purpose of it will be different. When we did this before, the purpose was to be able to pivot completely online and essentially mirror what would have happened in the classroom. And at the time, that was going to be for a number of weeks on end. But that's not what we're faced with now. With a window of a 5-day quarantine, even in a circumstance where we quarantined an entire class, okay, sometimes that might span a weekend, but even if that was 5 school days, that's going to give you a break essentially from the general population at the school for 2 days before the Saturday and Sunday before those 5 days, and the Saturday and Sunday of the next week. And so you would only have the need for that classroom for 5 days. So the purpose wouldn't be to create this robust thing where people could be on there and getting new instruction and being able to do multiple activities and things like that. It would be a much more streamlined approach where the teachers are just providing some very basic bullet point topics with associated worksheets or videos or things that can support those specific things. And it would only be for a 5-day period of time. After meeting with the teachers, one of the concerns was, because we asked them, is that possible? What would that add to your plate? They didn't seem to be all that worried about that. The concern became, well, what happens if I only have 2 or 3 kids in my class out? That means I'm still on campus with all the other kids. How do we support those 2 or 3 students who might be out if we're not quarantining the whole class? For that would need to be addressed. We can't stop, providing that learning for those kids who are out and tell them just to catch up when you come back. We wouldn't do that. But in addition to that, we also, the stop and start of, well, we're going to do it for 5 days and we're not, undermines that principle of continuity in a more fluid transition when we have to go online and come back. So we want to avoid those kind of break points. After additional discussion with staff, and we said that we were going to simplify what was required, and we clarified some expectations about what the classroom should look like, and that we weren't talking about generating what they did previously if they were here 2 years ago, that everybody felt much more comfortable with keeping that classroom updated every day, whether or not they had a class quarantine, so that if your kids were home, you would still routinely be able to check that site. And by us creating a really specific, defined list of resources that should be on there from day to day, they felt much more comfortable in being able to maintain that along with in-class teaching. Part of Friday was also to give people training and give them some time to ask questions for teachers who have done this before, so that everybody felt comfortable and was up to speed so that they could get a classroom up and going. And we had all of that in place starting this week. So that would be the second item. The third thing would be quarantine protocols. And I talked about that a little earlier, and that would be a switch from more aggregate monitoring of cases to more specific and granular analysis of cases. And it would involve a more aggressive and early approach to quarantining classes. So, this school year, we've only quarantined a whole class one time. We would be doing that on a more regular basis under this plan in order to avoid larger scale shutdowns or pivots to online learning. Number 4, in our discussion with the teachers, we really wanted to know how we can make this doable this year. There's a great deal of uncertainty comes when in their mind they start out the year, they're planning to get through X amount of content, they kind of have a pace set up, and then it gets constantly interrupted by students who are missing different materials. So you might have 3 kids who missed last week, and now you have 2 new kids who missed this week. And so those people create all of these outliers that add additional stress to teachers who are trying to keep up with kids who are now starting to trail off behind the group. And in addition to that, there's some unrelated pressures from the state that they're not related to COVID per se, but they add a significant burden, and that would be our lower grade teachers participating in letters training, which was mandated by the state for K through 3 language arts teachers. And it's a really significant time commitment. So in addition to dealing with all the things that are COVID related, and that might be stressful in a regular year, those teachers have a significant extra responsibility with regard to that training that's on their plate. So we decided that it was not unreasonable to say, how do we simplify life in other ways? If our priority is to to do core content subjects. And we did this to a larger degree when we 2 years ago, but our focus would be language arts and math, science and social studies as a tier 2 priority, and then specialties, electives, those kinds of things would be a tier 3 priority. And based on our circumstance at any given time, the number of cases, the number of classes that might be out, we may use those priorities to channel resources to where they need them the most. For example, if a class goes on line for 5 days, would we ask the music teacher to provide a specialty lesson online that we expected the students to do? We're not going to do that. In that moment, really the priority is to make sure that they can re-engage with learning and the core content when they get back. And so the experience might be modified from time to time to allow for teachers to focus on the most important things in those level 1 and level 2 priorities as far as subjects go. Number 5 on this list is staffing. I've covered that already, about the need there. What I will say is that our teachers are ready and willing to be as much of the solution as they can be. But given the difficulty in staffing, we need to reach out to parents. When I say we, I mean administration. We need to work with the FEC and reach out to parents and let them know just exactly the challenge this is adding to things, and that if they're really concerned about continuing on-campus learning, that we really need people who are able to step up and help with substitute teaching and to help with volunteering. And so that would be a combined effort. We would approach the FEC and let them know and answer their questions so that they realize the important linchpin that this is in having a plan that's workable. And my recommendation would be that they focus completely on generating interest in those things so that we have the depth chart necessary to continue to provide in-person learning. Because before, I really think it's just as big of an issue as the actual contagiousness of the infection when it comes to continuity of learning. And the last thing would be that we redirect some money that's currently, we have a few one-time emergency funding allocations from the federal government to address COVID-19 related impacts. And we had plans that we submitted and were approved for the use of that money. And I would suggest that we modify those plans, submit amendments to those plans to redirect some of that money to a couple different initiatives that would be most helpful right now. One of those would be, I think we should increase our FTEs on our janitorial staff during the day. We do have one person here all day, and then a regular year, that can be a lot of work just helping with lunch and cleaning up on a rainy day when everybody's tracking mud in. I mean, all of that stuff can fill up a person's day. And if we added another staff member in a short window of time to get us to the end of the year, and all we did was send that person around with a squirt bottle of disinfectant and a rag, and had them do touch surfaces and windows and those kinds of things, and just circle the building. 8 hours might be a long time, but they could do a couple other things. But their primary focus would be to work on those things, which are probably getting hit during the school day right now, maybe once in the middle of the day, 2 times possibly. But this would give us the ability to be double or triple the amount of cleaning that was done on some of those areas to minimize that the contagiousness of the day-to-day experience that the kids encounter. So that's the outline of the plan. The most significant part of that, in my opinion, from the board's point of view, is this move away from a case management aggregate thresholds of whatever they are. Currently, it's 30, to a more specific localized approach to try to address things as smaller groups as possible to keep everybody else online. So that's our proposal. It has, it was developed with the participation of the teachers, which we spent a lot of time with on Friday. And so those are our recommendations. I think all of you have been given or have access to the Google Doc where I outline those things in the plan amendments. And so I'll turn it over to you to answer any questions you might have about what we're proposing or the things that we're facing.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that and going through that. Board, what are your thoughts? What questions do you have? What comments?
Mark, I have a couple of questions. This is Emily Halleck.
Mm-hmm.
So now that we can, we're not bound by the 30 student threshold, we can come up with our own thresholds. What are those? Like, is there a certain number per class before the class moves online, or are those still kind of being developed? Do we have hard numbers?
No. This is just an outline. We from the time I met with the county, which I believe was not last Thursday or Friday, but the week before, we took that week to kind of clarify some of those things and really get input from as much of the staff as possible, because I didn't really come to the conclusion that this was a potential strategy until after our meeting on Friday with the teachers, when we've gotten their input and everything. So I only went so far as to say, this is the approach we want to take. And if you guys approve that approach, then I'm gonna have to go back and really dial in on, well, so what's that number in a particular classroom per se? I don't have that today.
Okay, great. And then as far as the Google Classroom, so I understand that if it gets to a point where like a whole classroom is affected, the whole classroom may move online for, the 5-day period. I'm still unclear though on if just a couple of students are missing school. What are we doing with Google Classroom? Are they still having access to assignments there?
Yes.
Okay.
I realized as I was explaining that I probably made it more confusing than it had to be. The fact is that information will be available for every school day, whether the kids are in school or whether the whole class is online.
Okay, so all teachers will be keeping a concurrent Google Classroom.
Yes.
With all assignments.
And that will, but just like we had to talk to them about, that doesn't mean that it'll be provided to the degree that you might have experienced a year or so ago when we were doing class online, right?
Right. It's really just for the kids who are missing school and more of the basic stuff.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
That's what I was just going to clarify, if I could, Mark, if I heard it correctly, you're suggesting that this would just be core curriculum that would be doing that.
Yes.
Okay.
Great. And I did just have a third question back to the on-site testing. I know there'd be a lot of details that would have to work out there as far as who runs it, that they're trained. I guess I did just have a question. We have been ordering tests, you mentioned. So do we already have sort of a stockpile? Have any of those been used?
I've used those primarily for teachers.
Okay.
When the most recent example, the teacher said, my spouse tested positive. I'm not positive. I don't have symptoms. Under the new guidelines, that person could continue to come to work with a mask on. But we kind of wanted to know, are you going to test positive before you show symptoms? And so we would give them a test. The way that they distributed those tests made them really difficult to share widely. And I think it was on purpose, and I understand why. But for example, if I ordered 40 tests, it came in a box, and there was a sleeve for the test itself. but the reagent that you have to use to actually conduct the test, there was one bottle of that, about half the size of an eye drop, that you would buy at the store.
Mm-hmm.
So I couldn't say to families, for example, here's 5 tests, because I only have that one bottle of reagent. So you had to do the testing yourself in order to be able to have the reagent that you needed. So that was kind of a pinch point in being able to provide it more widely. I don't know what the tests that they're offering now, I don't know what they look like or if it's going to be the same type of thing. But in any case, we would be offering that to a greater number of people. Now, what it would not be is it's not going to be like, hey, do you think you have COVID? You can come down to the school on Wednesday and bring your whole family. That's not what this is for. This is for, specific instances where we feel like clarification would be necessary. And so there's going to be cases where we say, yes, come down, we can test you. And other cases where we're going to say no. And that's largely because of the availability of the tests. And so they should serve a purpose. Otherwise, we could have a long line out this door for people who want to have tests too. And that purpose should be, can it provide some clarity for us and the families on who and for what length of time should they be quarantining?
Great. I think that's great, where it's a more strategic approach to testing. Some things just we'll have to consider. I know you'll have to work out all the details, but is like parental consent and notification on those.
Yeah,
So
I don't know who put together this program at the state, but they have the form in there for that. So there's like, here's how you get consent. Here's the form you use. This is what you do with the form when you get it back. So they've made it as easy, I think, as they can. And all that stuff's in a Google Drive folder, and I might be able to share that with you guys, and you could go through and see what they're providing us. But yes, I mean, all of those procedures, about how to test and how to manage that program seem to be accounted for in what they're providing.
Okay, those are all the questions I had.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Other board members? Cam, Jen?
I don't have any questions. No.
Yeah,
Okay.
Mark, this is very thorough. I don't have other questions. I might have one slightly, but I feel badly because if you've covered it, I apologize because of my child asking me a question at one point.
It's okay. Go ahead.
Anyway, just related to masks, because first of all, this is very thorough, and you and the teachers and the administration have done a really good job of thinking through different scenarios and different solutions, and this is fantastic. But when it comes to masks, you said this very thing, that if we don't have symptoms, if there's an exposure, but especially if individuals have been vaccinated and then don't show any symptoms, they can still continue life as normal. And so are there masks as part of this for students who've been exposed but are still fine without symptoms?
So we didn't address that specifically before. Okay. But my approach to that, I think, would be more to err on the side of, if you have one student who's been sent home to quarantine, that the other kids should too. Part of I've seen it both ways. People were certainly able, under the revised guidelines, to send their other kids to school when they're living with someone. But I don't think we want to encourage that because there are two fairly, large families that were in that situation in the last month, and both families decided when the first kid was sick to keep them all home. And then, which I think was helpful, because eventually they all did get sick. And so I would get, a report, the next 2 kids got sick, and they'd post it the next day. And then the fourth kid would get sick the next day. And eventually they all did get sick. And so some of these, our approach, is going to be, hey, as a community, we have to agree to some of these guidelines, and we're going to ask your family to quarantine in that circumstance, we have no authority to force them to do that, right?
Mhm.
But really, how much do we really want to ensure that our kids have access to face-to-face learning with their teachers? And we're going to just need families to buy into it for the good of everybody. Now, when it comes to the actual use of a mask, you'll see that my plan doesn't involve any of that, because some of the limitations that are still out there as far as to what our plan can or can't include, you can't require vaccines, you can't require masks, those kinds of things. So what we're going to be asking for is people's willing compliance on this stuff, even when it comes to quarantines, because more and more people aren't necessarily getting tested for everybody in their house. And so this really is going to live or die based on whether or not the Renaissance community can come together and buy in across the board on these things. But I think it'd be preferable to not have that student at school rather than have them come with a mask. But that's, again, something that I haven't determined yet. That would be like the next level, like with response to Emily's question. I'm gonna have to go through some of these things and then add some specifics. So exactly what do we want to do? What are we going to ask the parents to do? But that's on that particular issue would be my initial thoughts was we would prefer to be more aggressive about the family quarantining, given the fact that, those siblings can go out and cause, infection in other grade levels. And we want to be able to contain that as early as possible.
Thank you. That does make sense. I just am thinking if, obviously, they're, we don't know generally for 2 days prior to symptoms that somebody is actually spreading infection. So that does make it tricky. So the other siblings might be fine for a little while. So I can see and support having them stay home, but your document itself doesn't specify a certain timeline for
True.
Students needing to stay home. So I've heard some friends, in fact, one of my children's carpool said that their child wasn't allowed back in school until February 1st, which seems like a very long time away, given the fact that we know the spread of infection is really 2 days before and 3 days when symptoms occur. And so I just would hate for families to feel that they still had to stay home for 10 to 14 days.
I don't know if your carpool is the case I'm thinking of. But
no,
but there is.
These are not Renaissance. This is
Oh,
not a
okay.
Renaissance
So
carpool.
we have a family that had a similar situation in that a parent tested positive and they kept their kids home for the 5 days. The following week, over the weekend, they still, didn't have anything. Then the kids' symptoms cropped up the beginning of the next week. And so in the reporting portal, they said this is going to be their second week out of school because they were off last week in order not to spread things from from the contact they were having with their parent. That's a tough situation, right? Like, and more people would be probably in that situation in this scenario. And so we need to evaluate that more closely and determine, well, what's the level of risk and is the return worth it if we were to possibly put more families in that situation. I don't think it's ideal, but it's something we should consider more closely as we make the next round of, add the next level of detail to the plan.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. That's all I wondered, is how much time we're asking people to stay away, and if there are no symptoms and then testing is available, but also if family members are quarantining away from their family members. I mean, there are some of those details too that I think we, at least at my work, we have a very specific guideline that we follow, and as it relates to
I'm
exposure
definitely,
and et cetera. So
yeah. I'm definitely going to be using that document you sent me, in developing this kind of next level of things. I didn't want to get too far down the road. First of all, I didn't have a lot of time before this
Yeah.
meeting, but also that would have been wasted effort if we came to the meeting and you didn't, as a board, agree to the general approach. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So that's what I'll be working on in the next 48 hours is what does that look like? But you're right. Every case is so very different, for families like you mentioned, if they're quarantining away, then in that case, would those kids, should they still come to school? I would say yes, for no question. They're not exposed to that ongoing, potential, the potential to get the virus. So luckily, we're able to manage it at that level, given the fact we're one school, right? And so we should take advantage of that to provide people the most flexibility we can while keeping everybody in school.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And Jen, great questions. Lance, I know you are in and out of probably TSA or something right now, but if you can hear this and you'd like to give a comment or have questions or thoughts. I know he's still on, but he probably is standing in a line for check-in or boarding or something. But just generally, I appreciate the approach. I agree with your comments, Mark, that the purpose of this meeting is to establish a high level, approach to it. I love the idea of trying to keep people in the classroom as much as possible. And I think, if I love the idea of being at Renaissance and having the ability that we have to be a little more, I don't know what the word is. I wish I could be more flexible. Thank you, Cam. Just being able to come up with a way that allows the highest number of students to be in the classroom. My personal opinion is that that's the best approach. It obviously takes the entire group to be able to work together so that we aren't infecting all of our teachers or infecting all of our students as well. I see, Lance, you're back on. Do you have comments or thoughts that you wanted to propose?
Yeah, I've been trying to get back on. My questions are, so you kind of reviewed that. My question is, what is the purpose of this meeting? So we're going to be making a vote. We went over, I think, 5 or 6 items. And so my question was, could we have, Mark, would you be able to just give me a one sentence for all 5 or 6 of those points so I can review those points?
You mean summing them all up in one sentence?
Each point in one sentence, yes.
Okay.
Because I'm usually would take notes and sum it and have you clarify, but
This is not my forte, but I'm going to give my best shot.
This is the real test to Mark.
You want me to give it a shot, Mark?
What's that?
You want me to give it a shot?
Okay, yeah.
Let me see if I cover it. If you feel like something else is, if I'm off, I'm just going off the planned components. It is here. Number 1 is testing capacity. Establish on-site rapid result testing and quarantine facilities. Number 2 is quarantine support. Each classroom will establish an online Google Classroom that provides timely information and resources for those that are either quarantining away or at home or not able to come in person. Number 3 is quarantine.
Wait, repeat that for me, Mark. What was that again? Ryan, I'm sorry.
So support, meaning each classroom will have a Google Classroom portal for those who are not able to be there. It will not be up to the snuff of prior, last year, for example. They're not going to get the same level of support as online only classroom, but at least the student will have access to their lessons and things like that. Number 3 is the quarantine protocols themselves. The entire purpose is for the reducing of infection. The following guidelines, there's going to be a lot of that. Emily's question earlier was, what are some of those details? That's to be determined, obviously, now that if we do as a board vote to accept this as a potential kind of diversion from the current plan, which is not possible, then those protocols will actually be created. And the intent, the focus of those protocols would be to be more specific and flexible in what those quarantines are. Could it be just a classroom or just a family, for example, as opposed to the entire school being shut down? Obviously, with the focus to be keeping as many students in-person learning while not, increasing the spread of infection. Number 4, prioritization of core content learning. That Google Classroom and things like that we mentioned, those core components are that's the focus. If we have a music class, we probably won't be too overly critical of whether there's a music lesson. It'll also allow, there's a few things: control infection, reserve resources for higher priority activities. Number 3 was reduce workload for faculty and staff to offset the additional responsibilities. If 20 of your students are in person and 10 of them are at home, I'm making up numbers because we don't have that many, but in theory, right, you got a third of your class that you have to then, after class, then go and help support. If we could focus on core curriculum, that'll allow hopefully less burdensome on teachers if we're focusing on core content. Number 5 was staffing issues, just trying to avoid staff burnout, and then working with the FEC to make substitute and volunteer recruitment their top priority for the remainder of the year. It's going to take more people, more volunteer hours, more substitute time to be able to make sure that we can try and emphasize that. And I've seen that in other districts as well as our own. So it's definitely a high priority. And then number 6, the final one, was facility cleaning frequency. Those are the key components. We're going to potentially add full-time employees or equivalent to increase our cleaning schedule during the day. Hopefully, could benefit. So those are the key 6 items that we would be voting on. That make up the plan to replace the current plan that really isn't possible based on some of the testing data and things like that. How'd I do?
Great.
Questions, Lance? You feel?
Yeah, just the notes I had were, we're in this whole situation because we've changed from test to stay. And what is the availability of tests? I guess I know we've been getting tests over a period of time, but what is it?
We were getting the test from the state. The state has said that they can't get those tests anymore, but they will be able to continue to provide us with a different test. And they asked for people to put in their monthly order, and I ordered 760 today. And they say that I can pick them up at the distribution center on the 1st.
Okay. And then item 6, FTE, that's a full-time employee. That was in the notes. I was confused. Is that FTE full-time employee?
Correct.
Yeah.
And so that comes back to the cleaning we were talking about. So hiring a full-time employee to help with sanitation.
Maybe it's not full-time. It's really going to be a matter of us calling the janitorial company and saying, this is our situation. How can you increase service, to address this? Because I know that they're struggling, to keep staffing too. So, whether it's a whole FTE or not, but yes, add additional time during the school day to focus only on, sanitizing and disinfecting.
Okay. And so just to clarify what I understand is we have these 6 points we just reviewed, and it's not necessarily a specific plan, but it's a vote to approve.
Let's call it a framework.
To go forward. It's a framework to then put plans in place specific to these 6 items and process.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody else, board? Do we have any other thoughts, comments? Okay.
So, Mark, Ryan, I guess I just one question is, now there's more people at this board meeting than I've seen at any board meetings I've been here in 4 years.
Yeah.
Did we have anything open for comment, or?
We don't.
We don't. In emergency meeting, we don't have that.
Okay.
Obviously, we're well aware that everybody has strong opinions on this too, and that's part of the trick. But but we definitely feel like, we're trying to, thread a needle too. So,
Mark, I do have just one clarifying question. When it comes to focusing on the core content, the specialty subjects and that staff, they'll be fine, right? Like all staff will be whole still throughout this whole process. It won't affect their positions,
No.
or salaries or anything like that. Okay, so and the intent is for them to fill in possibly. Have they been doing that quite a bit, filling in classrooms if a teacher is needing to be gone?
No, not necessarily. That's primarily been done by the paraprofessionals.
Okay.
But, when we were doing online before, those specialty teachers did a number of different things and filled in where needed. They were very helpful that way and willing to do it.
Okay. Great. Just want to make sure everyone is whole in this whole process.
yeah, we're definitely using those funds for, there are some of those funds that are like we talked about with the facility cleaning stuff, but certainly for staffing and those kinds of things, we're making sure that's taken care of. So,
okay.
We definitely don't want somebody coming to work who should be staying home, but is, worried about their paycheck being impacted negatively.
Well, I would like to address that briefly. That we're essentially allowing people to take time off for COVID whenever they need it with pay. And, in addition to their regular time off, that's a significant investment on our part. There's not a real good way to track that. 2 years ago, the federal government made some requirements about, the number of days that you had to provide for COVID specific related absences and things like that. And all that expired and they didn't renew it, which kind of left us, with this wide open, figure it out. And we've continued to offer pay, even though that somebody's not here for COVID related things. We're tracking the number of days that they need that for, but nobody's running into a shortage of paid time off because they're out for COVID.
Yeah. Good.
Okay.
But that does pose a challenge for the school. Yes, I see that.
Okay. Well, board, with that information, I would entertain a motion to either move to approve the framework for the COVID plan or to recommend denial or decline approval of it.
I would like to.
Oh, I was gonna say, I don't know how to do this. Do I just say I approve a motion?
Yeah, I'd like
make
to
a motion.
Yeah.
Making one.
Okay. I want to do that.
Go for it.
Emily, I cannot tell. We ought to say this before everybody gets off, but we are so happy to have Emily on our board. She's brand
Yes,
new.
we are.
So we're so excited. If there are others of you listening who would like to join the board, we would love to have your application. I'm going to take this opportunity to make a plug.
Good call.
Thank you, Ryan.
That's what I thought Lance was going to do when he said there was a lot of people here. I thought for sure that's where he was
That's
going.
where he was headed. But so basically, you can make whatever motion you'd like. The motion in this case would be to move to approve the framework or move to decline the approval of it.
Okay, well, I'd like to make a motion to approve the framework.
Okay, we have a first from Emily to approve. Is there a second?
I second that, Emily.
So a first by Emily, a second by Jen. We'll do, because this meeting is virtual, we'll do a roll call vote, and I'll start with Cameron Hughes.
Cam Hughes, aye.
Lance Anderson.
Lance Anderson, yes. I approve.
Perfect. Jen Lambert
Jen Lambert, aye.
and Emily Halleck.
Yes, approve.
Perfect. And the chair votes aye as well. So the motion passes. I don't know how to count. I think that's 5-0, but we will be moving forward with this framework. We appreciate the time and energy, Mark. That is the lone item on our agenda from a discussion standpoint and for voting purposes. And so Unless there's anything that needs to come before the board immediately, then we will end our emergency board meeting.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great.
Hearing none, is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
We have a first. Is there a second?
I second the motion to adjourn.
Emily. So first from Jen, a second from Emily. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right. Opposed? Perfect. All right. Thank you all. We appreciate you all being here and appreciate staff and administration, parents. We're just trying to do our best to make sure everybody stays healthy too. So thank you, and we'll see you at the next meeting.
Thank
We'll
you.
see you in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Bye.
Bye.